This is the story of the USS Squalus, and what happened when a submersible finally reached the wreck and peered inside its dark metal tomb. What was found there was beyond horrifying. Veteran divers who went down to that submarine would later say they never forgot the feeling of looking through those portholes, never forgot the way the silence pressed against their ears, and never forgot the way 26 dead men seemed to still haunt those steel corridors decades after their last breath. It all began on what should have been an ordinary morning, May 23rd, 1939. Off the coast of New Hampshire, not far from the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, the brand new submarine USS Squalus prepared for a routine test dive. She was the pride of the United States Navy. Fresh from the shipyard, packed with the latest technology, built with obsessive precision, she had cost over $5 million at the time, which would be close to $100 million today. Every bolt was inspected, every valve tested. On paper, she was as close to perfect as a machine could get. The crew that morning were not amateurs. They were hand-picked. Submarine specialists. Men who knew what it meant to take a steel tube down into hostile, crushing water and bring it back up again. Their captain, Lieutenant Oliver Naquin, was calm, competent, and deeply respected. He wasn't a showman, he was a professional. And on that morning, his job was simple. Take the Squalus out, conduct a deep diving test, verify that all systems worked as designed, and bring the boat back home in time for lunch. If you've never heard of that before, imagine this. A submarine on the surface needs to breathe, just like a person. It needs air for its giant diesel engines. That air comes through a huge pipe, the main induction line. When the submarine dives, that pipe must close. Absolutely, without fail. If it doesn't, the ocean will pour straight into the boat. The Squalus had a modern, automatic system to close that intake. A safety device, foolproof, they said. On the control board, the main induction light glowed green. Green meant closed. Green meant sealed. Green meant safe. Naquin took that at face value. There was no reason not to. The system had been inspected, signed off, and praised. He gave the order to dive. Inside the boat, the diving alarm blared through the steel hallways, that eerie submarine klaxon. Men moved quickly but calmly to their stations. Above, the main diesels shut down with a fading growl. The electric motors engaged, almost silent by comparison. Outside, the sea began to swallow the hull. The deck washed over. The conning tower slipped beneath the waves. The Squalus began her descent. For a little while, everything seemed normal. The depth gauge moved steadily, 10 feet, 30 feet, 50 feet. The hull creaked and settled the way steel does when it starts to feel the weight of the ocean. Nothing unusual. Inside, the men went about their tasks, accustomed to that sense of pressure closing in all around them. Then, somewhere aft, a radio man looked up. He felt something, a shift in the air, a low rumble, a pressure in his ears that didn't quite match the depth they were at. And then it came. Not a drip, not a trickle, not a warning sip. It hit like an explosion. A roar of water blasted into the engine room with unimaginable force. 39 degrees seawater, under pressure, tore into the boat through a path that should have been sealed. The main induction system had failed. The ocean had found an open door. Up in the control room, Naquin felt the boat lurch. The stern dropped as the aft compartments filled with water, making the submarine tilt. The bow rose sharply. Men lost their footing. Tools slid, crashed, clattered. The depth gauge needle jittered. Something was horribly wrong. Naquin reacted instantly. He ordered emergency ballast blow. Compressed air roared into the ballast tanks, trying to force the seawater out and bring the boat back to the surface. For a brief moment, the Squalus slowed her descent. She even rose slightly. But then the weight of thousands of gallons of water in the aft compartments took control. Physics had made its decision. The submarine was going down. In the darkness of the aft compartments, men fought to close doors, save systems, and stay alive. But water at that pressure doesn't give second chances. It smashed through spaces, climbed bulkheads, clawed its way through the boat. The engine room, after battery compartments, aft berthing spaces flooded. The men back there had seconds, maybe less. Most never had time to fully understand what was happening. For those in the forward compartments, the horror was slower. The Squalus slid stern first toward the bottom. The angle grew steeper. Men were thrown against steel walls. Some slammed into instruments and pipes, others grabbed anything they could to hang on. The lights flickered, then failed, then surged back on in a dim, emergency glow. The depth gauge spun past 100 feet, then 150, then 200. Nobody knew how deep the seafloor was at that exact point. All they knew was that they were falling. When the submarine hit the bottom at roughly 240 feet, the impact was savage. The boat slammed into the mud with enough force to throw everyone inside like rag dolls. Teeth cracked against steel. Bones broke. Equipment snapped loose. Then, abruptly, everything settled. What followed was a sound that stuck with survivors for the rest of their lives. The groaning of the hull under pressure. Steel under strain makes a noise that's almost alive, like a giant animal hurting but refusing to break. The Squalus had come to rest on the seafloor, bow angled slightly upward, stern buried deeper in the muck, with her forward compartments miraculously intact and sealed. Inside that intact forward section, Lieutenant Nakin gathered his wits and his men. He ordered a head count. When they were done, they had 33 survivors. That meant 26 men were unaccounted for 26 in the flooded aft compartments. 26 almost certainly dead. Immediately the next brutal truth hit them. They were alive, but trapped. The depth they were at meant they couldn't just open a hatch and escape. 240 feet of water above meant more than 100 pounds of pressure on every square inch of the hull. If they tried to open the submarine to the sea and swim, the pressure would crush them or cause lethal decompression injuries on the way up, and the cold 39-degree water would finish the job in minutes. They were stuck in a steel bubble in the freezing dark, hoping someone up there would realize something had gone wrong. But up there, for a while, nobody did. Time in a sealed submarine starts to feel different. Every breath matters. Every movement uses oxygen. Naquin understood that the real enemy now wasn't the water outside, it was the air inside. Specifically, the carbon dioxide building up with every exhale. The men gathered what they could. They wrapped themselves in blankets, pressed close together to fight the cold. The temperature dropped quickly. The steel hull, surrounded by icy seawater, leached away every bit of warmth inside. Their breath condensed in the air. Fingers went numb. Faces stung. Naquin ordered everyone to stay as still as possible. No unnecessary talking. No pacing. No fidgeting. He knew that panic meant fast breathing, and fast breathing meant faster buildup of CO2. They spread soda lime absorbent around, a harsh, caustic powder meant to soak up carbon dioxide from the air. It burned their skin when it touched them, but they used it anyway. It was their only tool to stretch the time they had. Every submarine sailor knows another nightmare scenario: chlorine gas. The Squalus's massive batteries sat low in the boat. If seawater reached those batteries and mixed with the acid inside, it could create chlorine. In an enclosed space, that gas would be an instant death sentence. It burns the lungs, destroys tissue, and suffocates in the most horrible way. Nakwin crawled to the small valve they could use to test the air around the batteries. His hands were shaking, partly from the cold, partly from the knowledge of what he might smell when he cracked that tap. He opened it just a bit. Air hissed out. He sniffed carefully. No chlorine. For now. While the survivors lay in their steel coffin, time stretched. They listened to the hull creak. Every groan sounded like the boat was on the verge of collapsing. Somewhere behind the watertight door that separated them from the flooded aft compartments, they heard other sounds, faint thumps, distant clanking, strange vibrations. Was it the submarine settling into the mud? Loose equipment drifting and bumping? Or, for a few terrible minutes, did some wonder if a few men had somehow survived back there in a shrinking pocket of air? They tapped on the bulkhead with tools, trying to send a signal. Tap, tap, tap. Then silence. They waited. No answer came that they could clearly interpret as human. Meanwhile, at the surface, the Squalus was just late. At first, the people at Portsmouth Naval Shipyard weren't too concerned. Submarines sometimes returned from test dives a bit behind schedule. But as the minutes turned to hours with no contact, unease spread. The Squalus should have surfaced. It hadn't. The radio remained silent. The alarm finally went out. Another submarine, her sister ship USS Sculpin, was dispatched to search the area where Squalus had last reported. The Sculpin crisscrossed the grey Atlantic, crew scanning the waves, looking for anything out of place. For long stretches, there was nothing, just water, just wind. Then a lookout spotted it, a thin puff of red smoke on the horizon. Unknown to them, Nakwin, down in the mud, had ordered the use of one of their last emergency tools, a signal rocket, fired from the sunken submarine through a special ejector. It left the buried Squalus, shot upward, and broke the surface, releasing red smoke. If anyone topside had been looking the wrong way, if a wave had hidden it, if the wind had dispersed it too quickly, the signal would have meant nothing. But a pair of eyes saw it. The Sculpin closed in. Near the patch of red-stained water, they found something else floating. A small yellow buoy attached by cable to the Squalus below. Inside that buoy there was a telephone. The crew hauled it aboard. The captain grabbed the handset. His voice, tense but controlled, spoke into the device. "Hello, Squalus. Can you hear me?" Far below, in the dark, the bell inside the forward compartment of the submarine rang. For the trapped men, that sound was everything. It meant they weren't alone. Someone knew where they were. Someone was trying to reach them. Nakwin answered. His voice, by multiple accounts, was calm, almost unnervingly so. He explained what had happened in a clipped, professional tone. The main induction valve had failed. The aft compartments were flooded. 26 men lost, 33 still alive. Batteries holding for the time being. Air quality deteriorating. He didn't dramatize. He simply reported. The call was patched up the chain of command. The Navy now faced a brutal question. How do you rescue men from a steel tube sitting broken on the ocean floor, deeper than divers normally worked, with no direct way for the trapped crew to reach the surface? Experts gave interviews. Radios buzzed. Newspapers rushed out special editions. Opinions poured in. Many said it couldn't be done. The depth was too great. The equipment didn't exist. The risks were enormous. The chance of success? Tiny. And then a name surfaced, Charles Swede Mommsen. Mommsen had spent years obsessing over this exact scenario. He knew that submarines would continue to sink as long as navies relied on them. He hated the idea of crews being written off as lost with all hands when they might still be alive if only someone had a way to reach them. He had worked on escape equipment and rescue systems, often against stiff resistance from traditional-minded officers who thought his ideas were unnecessary or impractical. One of his projects was an experimental rescue chamber, a heavy, bell-shaped metal capsule that could be lowered from a surface ship to clamp onto the hatch of a sunken submarine. If it worked, men could step directly from their steel tomb into the rescue bell and ride it back up to the world of air and light. On paper, it was brilliant. In reality, it had never been used in a real emergency. The Squalus would be its first test. Mommsen rushed to the scene aboard the rescue ship USS Falcon, bringing the chamber and a hand-picked team of divers and technicians. Time was not on their side. The men inside Squalus were burning through their limited air supply. The rescue chamber looked almost comically simple from the outside, a big steel cylinder with windows, cables, valves, and a wide, heavy-looking base with a rubber gasket. The plan was straightforward in theory. A diver would go down, attach a guide cable to the hatch on Squalus, then the rescue chamber would ride that cable down like an elevator. When it reached the sub, the gasket would press against the steel ring around the hatch. Pumps would blow the water out of the space between chamber and submarine until a pressure seal was formed. Then both hatches could be opened without flooding either compartment. If the seal failed, though if that gasket leaked at 240 feet, water would blast into either the chamber, the submarine, or both. It would be over in seconds. The first diver to go down was Martin Sabitsky. This was 1939, no modern lightweight scuba gear, no high-tech suits. He wore the classic heavy canvas diving suit, weighted boots, and a huge copper helmet. Even worse, the depth meant breathing normal compressed air would likely cause nitrogen narcosis, a dangerous, disorienting condition that makes divers feel drunk and slow. To avoid that, Sabitsky used a helium-oxygen mixture which distorted his voice but kept his head clear. He descended into the murk, sinking away from the light. At the bottom, surrounded by cold blackness and silence, his helmet lamp carved a narrow tunnel of visibility through the water. Eventually, that beam fell on something that didn't belong to nature, the curved, mud-streaked hull of the Squalus. He found the hatch and attached the guide cable. Above, the crew of the Falcon eased the heavy rescue chamber into the sea. Cables groaned, pulleys complained. The big steel bell trembled as it began its descent, lowering into deeper and deeper water, heading for a submarine that, for all they knew, might already be filled with dead men. Inside the Squalus, the survivors heard it, a metallic thud on the hull, a vibration. Something heavy had just landed on the deck above them. Hearts raced. Was it rescue or some new disaster? Inside the chamber, the operators activated the pumps. They watched the pressure gauges. Outside, the gasket pressed against the submarine's hatch ring, trying to form a seal. The gauge needles moved. The water between chamber and submarine was being forced out. The seal was holding. Then came pounding on the submarine's hatch from above. Fists against steel, a sound that cut through the stale air. Naquin ordered the forward hatch opened. Careful, slow turning of the locking wheel. The metal protested. Air hissed as the pressure equalized between the boat and the rescue chamber. Finally, the hatch swung open, and there, for the first time since the disaster began, the trapped men looked into familiar, living faces from the outside world, clean uniforms, fresh air drifting faintly in. A voice from above said quietly, almost casually, "Hello, fellows, we're here to take you home." There was no time for long emotional reunions. The chamber could only take a handful of men at a time, 7 survivors plus the 2 operators. They had to choose who went first. They prioritized the weakest, men suffering most from exposure and CO2, men who wouldn't last if they were left for later. One by one, pale, exhausted sailors climbed into the steel bell. Some had to be helped. Some were nearly delirious. The hatch closed above them. The pumps worked again. The chamber detached and began its slow, creaking ascent back to the surface. On deck, when the hatch of the rescue chamber opened, the first rescued men were greeted by cold air and daylight. Some squinted and turned away from the brightness. Others laughed, cried, or just lay there in stunned silence. Against all odds, the insane idea was working. Trip 2, down, load, up. 7 more survivors. Trip 3, down, load, up. Another 7 men delivered from the deep. Now only one group remained, the last group, including Nakwin himself. They climbed into the chamber for the 4th trip, sealing the hatch behind them, leaving the silent forward compartment of the Squalus empty of the living for the first time since the sinking. The chamber started up. Everything was going according to plan. They were almost there. Almost. At around 150 feet, halfway up, something went wrong. The hoist cable jammed. Strands of the steel wire began to fray and snap. Tension built up on the line until it hummed like a tortured string. Inside the chamber, the men felt the movement stop. The chamber swayed slightly, suspended in cold black water, far below the surface and far above the seafloor, like a steel coffin hanging in nothingness. On the Falcon, alarms rang. If the main cable snapped completely, the chamber could plummet back down, hit the submarine or the bottom, and buckle. Everyone inside would be killed. For 4 hours, they hung there. Imagine that. You've survived a catastrophic flooding, hours trapped in darkness, suffocating air, and bone-deep cold. You've watched friends die. You've heard the hull groan like it's about to implode. You finally get into the rescue chamber. They tell you you're safe, you're going home, and then you get stuck, suspended in the middle of the ocean, listening to the groan of the cable above you and knowing that if it breaks, it's all over. Nakwin did what he could. He kept the mood steady. He spoke calmly to his men. Meanwhile, above, divers risked their own lives trying to free the cable and transfer the load to a backup line. Working that close to a jammed, heavily loaded steel cable is dangerous. If it suddenly whips or snaps, it can cut a man in half or crush him instantly. At last, the jammed part of the cable was cleared. The safety line took the strain. Slowly, agonizingly, the chamber continued its climb, inch by inch, until finally its top broke through the surface. When they opened the hatch and the last group pulled themselves out onto the deck, cheers erupted. All 33 men from the forward compartments of Squalus were alive. It was the greatest submarine rescue operation in history. Swede Mommsen's once ridiculed rescue bell had done the impossible, but not everyone from the Squalus had been saved. The submarine itself was still down there, resting on the seafloor with 26 men sealed inside the flooded aft compartments. The Navy wasn't willing to leave her there, not just because they wanted to recover the bodies, but because they needed to know exactly what had gone wrong. Squalus was new. If there was a design flaw, other submarines might be in danger. So they decided to raise her. What followed was a massive, months-long salvage operation. Divers went back down again and again, working in near-freezing water and almost total darkness, using high-pressure water jets to tunnel under the hull so lifting cables could be passed beneath. At that depth, nitrogen narcosis and fatigue played tricks on their minds. Some of them later described the feeling of being watched when they passed by the submarine's portholes, of sensing something on the other side of that glass. There are stories unconfirmed but persistent that some divers saw what looked like faces at those portholes, not peaceful faces. Faces twisted by terror or frozen in the panic of drowning, still pressed against the glass months after death. Maybe it was just imagination heightened by stress and darkness. Maybe it was shadows. Or maybe, for a moment, they really did see something looking back from the other side. The salvage crews attached large pontoons to Squalus, essentially giant metal floats that could be filled with air to create lift. On the first attempt to raise her, things went wrong. The submarine broke free of the seafloor more violently than expected. She shot upward too fast, came near the surface, then slipped free of her lifts and crashed back down again. It was like the ocean itself didn't want to let her go. The divers had to go back, re-rig the cables, and try again. It took 113 days from the sinking before the operation was complete. Finally, on September 13th, 1939, the USS Squalus broke the surface, water pouring off her hull as she rose back into the world of air after months in the cold dark. She was towed to the Portsmouth Navy Yard and placed in a dry dock. Then the pump started. Thousands of gallons of seawater, oil, and silt were drained from her interior. As the last of the water fell away, it revealed what had been hidden all that time. When the hatches to the aft compartments were opened, the scene inside was like something from a nightmare. Nothing was neat. Nothing was orderly. The violent flooding and the motion of the boat before it hit the bottom had tossed everything around. Heavy machinery was twisted and bent. Pipes were torn from their brackets. Personal belongings were scattered and half buried in muck. The walls were streaked with oil, grime, and growth from months underwater. The bodies of the 26 men who hadn't made it out were still there, but their positions told the story. In the engine room, many of the bodies were found not at the bottom of the compartment, but near the highest places up on pipes, clinging to ladders jammed against the ceiling. That detail alone is chilling. It means that during the flooding, air bubbles had been trapped at the top of the compartment, and the men had instinctively climbed toward that shrinking pocket of air. In the darkness, with icy seawater rising around them, they scrambled up anything they could to stay in the last few inches of breathable space. Try to imagine what that would have been like, hanging onto cold metal in total darkness, hearing the roar of water below you, feeling it creeping up, inch by inch, over your boots, your legs, your waist, your chest, feeling your breath growing faster as your brain screams at you that you're running out of time, maybe shouting to the others, maybe praying, maybe pounding on the bulkhead, hoping someone in the forward compartment could hear. And then, finally, reaching a point where there is no air left at all. In the aft torpedo room, investigators found a man named Sherman Shirley near the telephone. He had died at his station, handset near his body. He had stayed with that line until the very end, trying to relay information, trying to warn or coordinate, clinging to duty when there was no real hope left. His body placement suggested he had fought to communicate until the water claimed the room. Scattered among all this were the deeply human details that make a wreck feel less like a set of numbers and more like a grave. Letters never sent, some still legible. A pair of distinctive boots someone had been fond of. Photographs of wives, girlfriends, children. One picture, reportedly of a baby, was found floating loose. Maybe the man it belonged to never got to see that child in person. One discovery, though, stands out in the historical record and in the minds of those who study Squalus, the man in the escape trunk. The escape trunk was like a small vertical chamber, a primitive airlock designed so a few men at a time could potentially exit the submarine underwater. In practice, especially at the depths Squalus lay, it was almost useless without very specialized gear and an extremely controlled process. But in a disaster, people grasped at any chance. When the trunk was opened during the post-salvage inspection, they found a body inside. The remarkable thing was that he hadn't drowned in the same way the others had. Evidence suggested that he had managed to get into the trunk and seal the inner hatch, keeping the water out. He had survived the initial flooding, but he hadn't escaped. The pressure outside at 240 feet was so enormous that he simply could not open the outer hatch. It was like being inside a sealed metal box with someone leaning an elephant on the door. No human strength could have forced it open against that much pressure. He was safe from the water but trapped in a tiny, pitch-black metal cylinder with a limited air supply and no way to communicate. Some researchers believe this man may have lived for hours after the others had died, maybe even through part of the rescue operations. It's possible, though unprovable, that as the rescue bell made its repeated trips to the forward hatch, he sat alone in that suffocating tomb, hearing faint thumps and distant noises through the steel, not knowing exactly what was happening, only that whatever it wasn't coming for him. This idea is sometimes called the 27th survivor theory. 33 men in the forward compartments lived to be rescued. 26 died quickly in the flooding, and this man in the escape trunk may have straddled the line between those two groups, surviving longer than his doomed shipmates but still doomed himself, just a few feet of steel away from where the miracle was unfolding. When the Navy's investigation was completed, the official cause was clear enough in technical terms. The main induction valve had been left effectively open to the sea when the dive began. A mechanical failure in the control and indicator system meant that the light in the control room showed the valve as safely closed even when it wasn't. Inside the mechanism, a critical gear had broken, decoupling truth from indication. The captain trusted what the panel told him, and the ocean punished that trust. Was it just a freak mechanical failure? Faulty workmanship? Defective metal? A flaw in the design? Or something darker sabotage in the tense pre-war atmosphere of 1939, when the world was inching toward global conflict and espionage stories were everywhere? Officially, no sabotage was ever proven. The explanation remained mechanical error, a tragic accident. But rumors persisted in the shipyard and among sailors for years. Some said the Squalus had been born bad, cursed from the moment her keel touched the blocks. Others whispered about foreign agents meddling with critical systems. Nothing concrete ever surfaced, but the whispering never fully stopped. What happened next only fed the sense that this submarine had some kind of shadow clinging to it. The Navy didn't scrap the Squalus. Instead, they cleaned her out, repaired the damage, installed new equipment, and put her back into service. They gave her a new name, USS Sailfish. On paper, she was just another submarine, refurbished and ready for war. But the men who served on her knew exactly what she had been before. Some called her Squalfish behind the officers' backs. Others refused transfers to her if they could avoid it. Stories started to circulate among sailfish crews, tools that wouldn't stay where they'd been left in the engine room, strange cold spots even when the rest of the boat was warm, faint sounds of rushing water in compartments that were completely dry. Sometimes, late at night on patrol, someone would swear they heard a muffled bang on a bulkhead, like an echo of a long-ago tap for help that never came. Cursed or not, the newly christened Sailfish went on to become one of the most successful American submarines of World War II. She prowled the Pacific, sinking Japanese ships and earning 9 battle stars. The boat that had nearly killed all her own crew in peacetime became a deadly predator in wartime. But the ocean and fate weren't done weaving strange patterns with her. Years later, as the war raged, the Sailfish launched an attack on a Japanese aircraft carrier escorting a convoy. The crew did their job. Torpedoes were fired. Explosions followed. The target was hit, badly damaged, and later went down. When the full story emerged, it turned out that this Japanese carrier, unbeknownst to the sailfish crew at the time, had American prisoners of war on board. Those prisoners came from another US submarine captured by the Japanese. The name of that submarine? USS Sculpin. The USS Sailfish, as she was renamed, became a war hero. That much is documented. She sank over 24,000 tons of enemy shipping during her service in World War II. She earned those 9 battle stars through skill, bravery, and relentless hunting. The crew that served on her were professionals, dedicated and determined. But something else served on that boat too. Something that never left, no matter how hard you scrubbed the steel or repainted the hull. Crews reported strange occurrences with such frequency and consistency that it eventually became common knowledge among submarine sailors. Not something you'd put in an official report because who would believe it and what would the Navy do about it? But something you whispered about in the galley? Something you acknowledged when you thought no one was listening? The tools were the first thing. In the engine room, mechanics and engine men would place a wrench on a workbench, turn around to grab something else, and when they turned back, the wrench would be gone. Not fallen on the floor, not moved a few feet away, completely gone. Sometimes, mysteriously, it would reappear hours or days later in a completely different part of the boat. A screwdriver might be carefully placed on a shelf in the forward torpedo room, only to be found later wedged into a piped fitting in the aft compartments. How it got there, who moved it, remained a mystery. One sailor swore that he had left his lucky watch on his bunk before going on watch. When he returned 4 hours later, the watch was on the opposite side of the boat, sitting on a workbench in the forward compartments. He lived alone in a small crew's quarters. No one had any reason to move it. No one had been in that space, yet there it was. Another incident, reported by multiple crew members over different deployments, involved the temperature. The engine room would suddenly develop a cold spot, a localized area where the temperature would drop noticeably, even though the diesel engines were running at full capacity and generating tremendous heat. Men working in that spot would feel their breath mist, would see their skin goose up with cold, but the rest of the compartment remained warm. The cold spot would move. One day it was near the main engines. The next day it was by the battery compartments. Then it would be by the watertight doors. And just as mysteriously as it appeared, it would vanish, sometimes for weeks, sometimes only to return with a change of crews. The sounds were worse than the unexplained movements. In the silence of the night watch, when the submarine was running submerged and most of the crew was asleep, men on watch reported hearing water rushing. Not the normal ambient noise of the ocean against the hull, not the expected sounds of pumps and equipment, but a sudden, violent roar of water like the moment during the original sinking when the induction valve had failed and the ocean came pouring in. The sound would come without warning. Men would snap to attention, ready to report a catastrophic failure. They would check the gauges, examine the compartments, verify that every seal was intact, and then nothing. The water was there. The gauges were fine. The boat was dry. It was just sound without source. An echo of disaster that lived in the steel. Some sailors heard the bells. Not alarm bells, the deliberate klaxons of submarine emergency procedures, but softer ringing, like someone tapping on metal in a deliberate pattern. Tap, tap, tap. Long pause. Tap, tap. Another pause. Then silent. The same rhythm over and over. The same rhythm the survivors of the original sinking had used when they tried to communicate with the flooded aft compartments, trying to tap a message to ghosts, trying to reach men who were already dead. One particularly unsettling report came from a crew member who claimed that during a deep dive in the Philippine Sea, he heard footsteps in the aft torpedo room. Actual, distinct footsteps. Someone walking through the compartment. He called out, thinking another sailor had wandered there. No answer. He went to check, and the compartment was empty. No one else was anywhere nearby. Yet the footsteps continued, echoing through the metal until he ran from the compartment in terror and reported it to his commanding officer. The CO, a seasoned captain who had served on the original Squalus during its salvage operations, simply nodded and said, "It happens. Don't worry about it." The phenomenon became so well known among submariners that men who had served on sailfish would warn new crew members before they shipped out. If you serve on the sailfish, they would say, "You're serving with ghosts. Accept it. Don't fight it. Don't let it get in your head. And whatever you do, if you're alone in the engine room or the torpedo room late at night, don't look directly at the portholes or the observation ports, because some men swore they saw faces looking back. Not human faces, exactly. More like impressions, shapes, smudges against the glass. Patches of darker water that resolved, if you stared long enough, and your mind started to play tricks into the contours of a face. Fear and panic still etched into whatever remained. One sailor, after his deployment, reportedly never fully recovered from what he claimed he had seen pressed against the glass of a porthole at midnight. He left the Navy, left the coast, and spent the rest of his life trying not to think about that submarine. Of course, there are rational explanations for most of these accounts. The ocean does strange things to the human mind. Nitrogen narcosis, even in the limited form that modern divers experience, can create hallucinations. Stress, isolation, and the constant low-level awareness that you're living inside a metal coffin suspended in an alien environment can make the mind conjure sounds and visions. The movements of objects could be explained by the motion of the boat, vibrations from equipment, the effect of air pressure changes on lighter items. The cold spots could be caused by localized circulation patterns or equipment malfunctions. There's always a logical explanation. But logic doesn't quite feel satisfying when you're inside a dark submarine, hearing inexplicable sounds in the middle of the night, knowing the history of the vessel you're in, knowing that 26 men died violent deaths within the steel walls surrounding you. Logic feels cold and distant. What feels real, what feels immediate and present, is the sensation that something is there with you, something that never quite left, something that lingers in the spaces between the rivets. The USS Sailfish survived World War II. She made it through the entire war without being sunk, despite numerous close calls and dangerous patrols. When the war ended and the submarine was decommissioned, she was technically offered for scrap, but for a while she was preserved, studied, documented. People wanted to understand her. They wanted to examine the hull of the boat that had made such an impossible return to active service, that had become a war hero despite or perhaps because of what she carried inside her. Eventually, like all ships, the Sailfish was broken up. Her hull was cut apart. The metal was recycled. The spaces that men had inhabited, suffered in, died in, and haunted were dismantled piece by piece. The steel that had groaned under pressure and held the ocean at bay was reduced to scrap. The compartments where strange things had happened were separated, exposed to daylight and air for perhaps the first time since the original disaster. When the submarines comes apart, when you take the cutting torch and sever that metal that had endured so much, do the ghosts finally leave? Do they dissipate into the air? Or do they cling to those pieces of steel, traveling with them to shipyards and foundries, melted down and reforged into new ships, new structures, carrying their weight into the future? That's the question that historians have never quite answered. What we do know is that the lessons from the USS Squalus disaster changed submarine design forever. The multiple redundancy systems that were developed in the aftermath of the sinking became standard on submarines worldwide. The rescue technologies pioneered by Swede Mommsen became the basis for submarine rescue operations for decades. The safety procedures, the fail-safes, the backup systems, they all trace back to that catastrophic failure on May 23, 1939, and the desperate effort to save those 33 men. In a way, the 26 men who died and the mystery of the 27th survivor in the escape trunk became teachers. Their deaths, in all their horror, in all their tragedy, led to improvements that saved countless other submarine crews in the years and decades that followed. The USS Squalus cost the Navy and the nation in blood and heartbreak, but it also left a legacy of safety and survival that echoed through naval history. The wreck of the Squalus was eventually left where it was. For decades, it rested on the seafloor of Portsmouth, a tomb and a memorial, visited occasionally by divers and researchers wanting to understand what had happened, wanting to look one more time into those dark compartments and try to comprehend the final moments of the men trapped there. In recent years, advanced submersibles have been able to visit the wreck in deeper detail than ever before. High-definition cameras have peered into the interior. 3D mapping has documented the spatial relationships of the compartments and the locations where bodies were found. The wreck has become a historical archive, a physical record of disaster and human tragedy that can be examined by anyone with the technology to reach it. But even with all that documentation, even with the cameras and the data and the analysis, the wreck maintains its power to disturb. Because you can know all the facts, you can understand the physics and the mechanics and the timeline of the flooding, you can examine photographs and read reports and watch videos, and yet when you see that dark steel, that cramped metal chamber that was the tomb of 26 human beings, when you see the places where they spend their last hours in terror and pain, knowledge doesn't make it easier. If anything, it makes it harder. It makes it real in a way that abstract understanding never can. The story of the USS Squalus is, on one level, a story of technological progress and human ingenuity. It's about how a seemingly impossible rescue was achieved through determination and innovation. It's about how men like Swede Mommsen refused to accept the verdict that the trapped sailors were already dead and instead pushed forward with an untested rescue method that worked against all odds. But it's also something darker. It's a story about the price of progress, about the cost of pushing human technology and human courage to the limits. It's about men who died so that other men could live. It's about the weight of that sacrifice, the way it settles onto the steel and never quite leaves. The submarine that became the USS Sailfish, the renamed and resurrected ghost of the Squalus, continued to haunt the memory of everyone who knew her history. Even after she was scrapped and melted down, even after her component parts were dispersed across different facilities and possibly incorporated into new ships, the story persisted. The strange occurrences reported by her crew became part of submarine folklore. The tale of the 27th survivor, the man in the escape trunk, became something that every submarine sailor knew, a cautionary reminder of how fragile life is in a metal tube underwater. And perhaps that's the most important legacy of the USS Squalus. Not just the technological improvements, though those are significant, not just the rescue success, though that was remarkable, but the reminder that the ocean is not forgiving, that submarines are fundamentally dangerous, no matter how well engineered they are, that 26 men can die in seconds, leaving only mystery and questions behind. That one man might survive just a little bit longer than the others, trapped in darkness, waiting for rescue that never came, becoming a phantom in his own tomb. The divers who have visited the wreck in recent years have reported a particular feeling when they're down there. It's not just the pressure of the water, though that's real and measurable. It's something else, a weight, a presence. The sense that they're not alone in those dark compartments, even though they know intellectually that there's nothing there but steel and silence and the slow work of time on metal. Some researchers have suggested that this is just psychology, the power of the known history to create a sense of dread. And they're probably right. But there's something else too, something that can't be quite explained away. It's the simple fact that 26 people died in those compartments. Their terror, their pain, their final moments, those things are real. They happened. And you can feel them when you're down there, when you're floating in the cold dark, looking at the place where they took their last breaths. The USS Squalus disaster of 1939 remains one of the most significant submarine events in American naval history. It's a story that combines heroism, tragedy, miracle, and mystery in equal measure. It's a story that has been documented, analyzed, and discussed for over 80 years. But it's also a story that refuses to be fully explained, a story that keeps yielding new questions even as it answers others. When you look at the facts, the mechanical failure, the rescue operation, the salvage effort, the recommissioning of the boat, you see a logical progression of events. But when you look deeper, when you listen to the accounts of the men who served on the sailfish, when you read the reports of the strange occurrences and the unexplained phenomena, you start to wonder if there isn't something more, something that transcends the rational and the explainable. Perhaps that's fitting, because the sea has always been a place of mystery. It's always held secrets. And the USS Squalus, in both her incarnations, seems to have carried those secrets with her, guarding them even after she was broken apart and her steel was scattered to the winds. The men of the USS Squalus, the 33 survivors and the 26 who perished, including the mysterious 27th who may have lived just a little longer in darkness and isolation, they left us a legacy that extends far beyond the technical improvements to submarine design. They left us a reminder of human fragility and human courage. They left us a story that still has the power to chill the spine and raise questions that can never be fully answered. And somewhere, in the collective memory of the Navy and the history of submarines, in the stories passed down from one generation of sailors to the next, they remain alive in a different way, not forgotten, not fully at rest, serving as a constant reminder of what it means to venture into the deep, to push the boundaries of human exploration and capability, and to accept the risks that come with trying to conquer an environment that will always, ultimately, be beyond our control. The USS Squalus sank on May 23, 1939. 33 men were rescued, 26 died. And one man, perhaps, waited in the darkness just a little longer, hoping for a rescue that never came, becoming a ghost in the machinery that would haunt the sailfish for the rest of her service. If this story resonated with you, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our next deep dive into extraordinary maritime history and the mysteries that still surround us. Also, drop a comment below and let me know what aspect of the Squalus story affected you most. Share this video with someone else who loves history and mysteries. The ocean keeps its secrets. But some of those secrets, like the USS Squalus, demand to be told. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.